We are back. Sam Seder on the Majority Report on the phone. It is a pleasure to welcome to the program senior writer for ESPN.com, a contributor for Sports Weekend, a sports contributor for Weekend Edition on NPR and author of Full Dissidence, Notes from an Uneven Playing Field. Howard Bryant, welcome to the program.
No, thanks for having me.
The book is a series of essays that looks at race in the context of, in some experience, your personal experience, some from the world of sports, others just more broadly in terms of like the way that we treat police in this country and so on. You look at the story of Tanya Roberts. Some of the book is Massachusetts-centric, which I appreciate. But let's start with just the idea of full dissidence. What is that concept, and how does it tie these essays together?
Well, the concept for me was, I think it was a recognition after so many different iterations of being told that things were getting better and that your country was going to represent you in a certain way if you did all the right things, where you sort of recognize that that's not the case, that where we are today, especially coming after the 2008 election, certainly after the 2016 election, certainly after all the places where we've been, whether we're talking about Ferguson or whether we're talking about wealth inequality or all these other things, it's that this feels like it's the idea of the American dream is getting away from us, or getting away from me. And there was no question in my mind that I sort of felt like that that 2016 was a tipping point. And I was talking mostly about Colin Kaepernick in 2016, when the great news story of the day was that he didn't vote in the 2016 election, and I just was on the air on ESPN. And I said that maybe he just went full dissident, and maybe he recognized that there was no point being involved in this system when it doesn't feel like it represents you. And we were really talking about the fact that maybe a lot of people have sort of felt something along those lines, and it manifests in a lot of different ways.
It's fascinating because, just coincidentally, and we're pre-recording this, but today on the live show, I interviewed a professor of political science at UC Irvine, Davin Phoenix, who wrote a book called The Anger Gap. And it is about how, in particular, how Black Americans, how anger does not play in the same way to them as it does to white voters. And part of that is a function of what you've expressed about Kaepernick, which is this idea of fundamentally, Donald Trump is not sui generis in terms of their experience of America, that he is, following a long tradition of American politics, and the way that anger is expressed by African Americans is not necessarily electoral, because they don't have necessarily that luxury, and they don't find that there's necessarily an outlet to redress that anger.
No, not only is there not an outlet to redress that anger, but there's nothing happening to Black America that wasn't happening before. And that's one of the points that I was trying to make in this book. I remind my 15-year-old son quite often when he talks about all his school friends, talking about Trump and repeating their parents and Trump this, Trump that. And then I talk to my own friends, and especially my white friends, who have treated this period like it's the apocalypse. And I remind them, who was the president during Ferguson? Who was the president during Eric Garner? Who was the president during Oscar Grant or Amadou Diallo or Abner Louima or all of these or Rodney King? So when you think about our experience, this isn't the apocalypse for us. It doesn't mean we don't care. It certainly doesn't mean that Black people have checked out, but it does mean that the experience of democracy, the idea of democracy. For me, the idea of full dissidence is the recognition that you've been getting punched in the face for a lot of years. But unlike what I see in my countrymen and sort of the counterpart here, we haven't gotten punched in the face for the first time. A lot of people here have been treating this moment as though it was the first. In fact, you're seeing it right now in the post-mortem coverage of Elizabeth Warren, which is somewhat surprising to me. But a lot of commentary has made it seem like women are recognizing that the world's not fair, and that what that says to me isn't that this is the first time necessarily that they've recognized it, but they have a belief that fairness is due them, and I don't think that is an outcome that I see as tenable or even something that you can look forward to. It constantly gets reminded to us whose country this is, and every time you start to see some form of any sort of perceived black advancement, there is an enormous backlash.
What of that? I mean, what about that dynamic of that? That I'm curious of, that when you, because literally what you've just described is what this political scientist found in terms of data and whatnot, is that notion of black people just have not had that type of anger within the context of the electoral politics, because their sense is like the expectations aren't there necessarily. What does seeing that sense of like, wow, that's quite a luxury that you have, that you feel like you've been cheated, or that you've been somehow like that there's an unfairness,
Yeah, it produces an eye roll, no question, and it's not just an eye roll. It is, in some ways, there's a bit of envy that you can have that luxury of feeling like there's something here for you. And one of the elements of this book for me was, as long as I've been alive, the American attitude toward us has always been, from black and white Americans and everybody in between, we're not perfect, we're getting there. There is an aspirational element to America. There's always been that aspirational element to America, that if you come here, you will have a great life if you try to have a great life. And that great life should be exceeded by your children, and then their children will exceed them. There is an aspirational quality to all of this. That's not what I feel today. What I feel today, especially in the American flag, is that the American flag is something, it's a concept to be obeyed. It's a symbol to be obeyed. It's not aspirational. It is love it or leave it, which is a term we've heard before, but it's certainly post 9/11 and certainly post Trump very much feels like that it symbolizes a reclaiming. And so one of the questions in the book for African Americans and for all citizens is, what do you do with that reclaiming? How do you treat this reclaiming? And for African Americans, that reclaiming certainly comes from from a flag standpoint, certainly from a policing standpoint, certainly from the standpoint of having a say in this. So often when you even hear the president say things like, maybe you don't belong here, or love it or leave it, or go back where you came from. Well, we're from here, aren't we? Don't we have a piece of this? But also for white citizens as well, as they're finding out, when you're looking at concepts of wealth inequality and oligarchy and all these other concepts that we're talking about, as money and celebrity distances itself from average people, and as labor becomes more and more and more suppressed. What does this mean for how you view this country?
And we should, and just to be clear, that reclamation you're talking about is the reassertion. I mean, which is not to imply that it went away, but a sort of more vigorous reassertion of white supremacy.
Well, absolutely, the mainstreaming of it. I mean, that when for as long as I can remember, you couldn't use these words, you couldn't speak in these terms. It was an automatic disqualifier to talk talk about white nationalism. It wasn't part of the country's aspiration. It wasn't part of the country's wasn't part of the country's future. At least it wasn't expected or treated to be part of the mainstreaming. Today, it is completely mainstreamed. It is a part of the government. It's embedded in the government. It's embedded in media. It's embedded in coverage. It's embedded in police. When you look at some of even the FBI, the FBI studies and research show that there's an element of white supremacy embedded in our police, and nobody cares. And it's not an outrage to people, and they just sort of roll their eyes and shake their head that Richard Spencer exists or that Stephen Miller exists, and it's not that big a deal. And that says a lot to me, and that is chilling to me in some ways, but in other ways it reminds me of this reclaiming that we're talking about. This is precisely where we've been headed. It explains the election, and it certainly explains as a reaction to the first black president. It's pretty obvious, and that's the reason why I don't think you see the anger. Where I do see something, Sam, that I do think is really sort of interesting, is I do fear for the younger generation of African Americans, especially the really well educated, and who weeps for the Ivy League, but still,
right.
The ones who maybe 2008 might have been their first election, and then they see this as a reaction. For the older generation like myself and my parents and my grandparents, they wouldn't have been shocked because you can go historically and you see the backlash whenever something happens for black people in terms of progress. But for that generation, how many times had they been told about being colorblind, and how many times had they been told post-2008 about post-racialism, and that the Obama election was supposed to create this new thing, and instead it's created more retrenchment. I
mean, it's funny that you say that, and I promised the last time I'll bring up this book, but that was the data shows.
I thought we were talking about my book.
No, well, I know, but also, but this is, I mean, your book, obviously, but the data shows that apparently under the age of 29, black people express their anger through electoral politics, and it is not and that is this cohort of under 29s, not in the past. And that what you're expressing is exactly what the data shows, that there is a different perspective, and that on some level their expectation of what they deserved is higher in some fashion, that is actually having them react with anger. And we're seeing that divide in the 2020, well,
I can tell you, Sam, during this campaign and not during the primaries, but during the debates, several of my African American friends, and one of my best friends, if not my best friend, has said to me often during the summer, especially, maybe this is the one we should sit out. Maybe because we've done our part. We've done everything that's been asked of us. You asked us to come out and vote. Democratic Party can't exist without the black vote, right? We've done what you've told us to do. We've done all the things that we were told we needed to do to be citizens. And yet, electorally, the Democratic Party only comes around every 4 years, and our votes are supposed to be tallied, but we're not supposed to ask for anything in return for them. And what would happen if we just said, hey, you know what, we've already been here before. You guys are the ones who are talking about this apocalyptically. We're not. We've been here. We have already lived under the idea of democracy while Jim Crow existed and while slavery existed and while all this inequality has existed. And I said to him, are you serious? Are you really talking about not voting in 2020? He's like, well, how bad could it get? Maybe now, if the Democratic Party got completely annihilated because black people stayed home, maybe now they'd finally listen to us and pay a little bit more attention to us. And it's interesting to me that you actually saw the reverse happen in South Carolina, and it's actually turned the tide for Joe Biden.
Right.
That you saw that black people instead decided to retrench and say, no, we have a stake in this. We worked too hard for our vote. We worked too hard to get this vote. And we're going with what we know, and we're not experimenting. We don't have the luxury to experiment. And we're going to stay solid blue. And we're going to show up, because if you look at turnout, how many times did African Americans get blamed for low turnout? The turnout's been good. So once again, you see how serious black people take the democracy. And at the same time, privately, you see the frustration that are you getting a commensurate amount of democracy for your commitment? And the answer is clearly no.
Let's talk a little bit about Kaepernick and this concept of power and how his story essentially, and you're a sports writer, and so you've seen this dynamic, and maybe it just the whole Kaepernick thing made sort of crystallize some things for you on some level, but how Kaepernick sort of exposed the fact that black people needed to subjugate themselves, that even with the amassing or theoretical amassing of power, it came with that illusion of power came with a subjugation of really the exercise of power.
No question. And I think that it's one of the reasons, that exercise is one of the reasons for this book. When I was finishing my last book, The Heritage, I was really talking about this return of the athlete activist and the return of the athlete exercising their power, whether it was LeBron James or Colin Kaepernick or whomever. And then I also began, after that book came out, I began asking a secondary question, which is, how much power do you actually have if you're not allowed to speak? Do you really have power if by speaking and advocating for a position, you risk losing your livelihood, losing your career, losing your standing, losing everything? And what I began to think about, which is really how this book began to germinate, was we have what you're talking about in terms of the illusion of power and the amassing of power is not the amassing of power, it's the amassing of money. What these players have a lot of is money. What they don't necessarily have a lot of is power. And that first essay, What Colin Kaepernick Taught Us, to me is an example of that. And it was an example to me also of my own mind needing to change. I think I was wrong on Colin Kaepernick. I was from the standpoint that I had enormous amount of support for him, and in my writing, I certainly supported him as a columnist. There's no question about that. But as he went on those first couple of years without giving interviews, without speaking, while really aligning himself, and sort of his social media presence seemed to be more celebrity-based, even though he was doing phenomenal work in the community still, there were still grassroots activists, black grassroots activists, who were asking why he wasn't leading more. They were asking the question, how come he hasn't given an interview? How come he hasn't led the way? And so there was a fear on my part that he had sort of, please don't go Hollywood, please don't go your own way. Whereas I don't believe that everybody needs a beacon or a guiding light. Some people really did. But then something else happened, and that was when Nike came back with his commercial back in 2019. I began to think about this. And the reaction, especially the white reaction, the law enforcement reaction, in so many ways, was so hostile, simply because this man had a commercial. He didn't get his job back. He wasn't in the NFL. All he did was voice over a 45-second commercial. And you saw law enforcement trying to boycott Nike. You saw some retailers boycotting Nike. You saw an enormous backlash to a simple commercial. And what that told me was that Colin Kaepernick needed more respect and more support, because there was a truly hostile reaction to this man, and it began making me ask a question. Why was it so important to completely annihilate this man? It's bad enough he didn't have his career. Why was it so important to completely annihilate? This is Paul Robeson level, to completely destroy everything about him, his ability to even earn a penny. And that told me that he needed more support. And it also said a lot about where we were in this country, that this was accepted.
And the idea being that you can't allow a black man who has a platform to express this much dissidence with America and not be completely destroyed because you're sending the wrong message to presumably to the rest of black people, I guess, and whatnot.
No question. And I feel like there was that, and it made me think about sports in general, and it told me that there's an enormous level of anti-blackness in sports, that this is that trade-off that you were talking about earlier, that you get the money, and here's what we expect from you. We expect you to subjugate, that there's a price to this. And if you had real power, there's no price. If you have real power, you get to take yourself with you. You get to take all of you with you in the journey that you go when you go forward. And what I saw during this, especially in the reaction to Kaepernick, was, and the black reaction to Kaepernick from a lot of the athletes too, was this idea once more that something is being asked of you, and it goes beyond sports. It goes to sort of black aspiration and black ascension. Whether you're an upper middle class, whether you're an upper middle class doctor, whether you're a teacher, whether you're a journalist or whatever, that there's a certain deal that you're making. And I began talking about that in one of the chapters, one of the essays called "The Worst Thing in the World," where I discussed this idea of the more I have climbed in my career, usually it's been the further you've been pulled away from blackness. The better schools are when you get away from the black community. The better neighborhoods are when you get away from the black community. The more opportunity is when you don't talk about or advocate for black people. So the more you distance yourself from black ideas, from the black community, from the black concept, the better off you'll be. And we see it with athletes, whether it's Tiger Woods or Michael Jordan or whomever, that impulse is there. And it doesn't necessarily mean that the players engage in it, but it does mean that they're being asked to do this, that there is enormous pressure there.